Hello. So I'm going to do my second month reports on what I have noticed regarding Latin American politics since I've moved here about 2.5 months ago. So within this last month, I have become more aware of both the political and the cultural dynamics of Argentina and more of the general concept of Latin America, including how that term is an oversimplification of the diverse region and Latino culture. Especially coming from my Mexican American background, this is quite an interesting concept I'm seeing develop. So, additionally, there has been a shift in the political attitudes across Latin America that I am witnessing here firsthand. It's ranging from Brazil's Supreme Court trial on ex-President Bolsonaro and the American maritime intervention that is changing Venezuela as we speak right now. So today I'm going to discuss the topics I gained extensive knowledge on and try to analyze these themes in regards to the appropriate context of political and cultural implications it has for the greater region. So I attended some more lectures related to the ongoing developments in Argentina politics. And one of the lectures I attended discussed how La Libertad Avanza, the party of President Javier Milei, has been able to garner support from the rural regions of the country that used to support Peronism and the workers' movements of before. And this lecture was before the provincial elections of the province of Buenos Aires, which is not to be confused with the city of Buenos Aires. And it seemed that the rural areas, which is what a lot of Buenos Aires province is made of, have been becoming more drawn to Mileism because of the promised change in reducing state intervention that was a promising concept to many voters in the 2023 elections that did vote for Milei in power. So this is what one of the lectures at the event I attended described as an ongoing trend that the lecture didn't necessarily claim was an all-encompassing answer to how the later rural regions were going to vote in the upcoming elections, but it was instead an implied visible trend that the lecturer was pointing out. So what ironically happened a week later with the elections of the provincial of Buenos Aires province was Milei's party having lost big losses in this province to the Peronists, which are led by Alex Kicillof. And this succeeded after Milei even was campaigning in the province before with the election for the upcoming elections, where he was thrown rocks at in the suburb of Lomas de Zamora. And this was where residents were showcasing both support and strong disapproval and physically attacking the president as he passed through the streets on vehicle. So what we have been witnessing is that the support that once went towards Peronism and the workers' parties that eventually shift course in 2023 towards Milei's neoliberal approach has now reshifted again. Maybe not necessarily back to Peronism, but away from the incumbents movement, as it is proving itself unpopular both in the rural and outer Buenos Aires suburbs that have grown disillusioned by Milei's so seemingly failed promises of supporting Argentina as the economy continues to fluctuate and the peso continues to lose its value. So the price of everyday services and products I am seeing here, like groceries or just laundry services, I have witnessed are increasing since I first got here about 2.5 months ago. And for many Argentines, their wages aren't matching this change, at least not at the same rate that they expected to. The Buenos Aires provincial elections have been a key example of this growing current discontent with Milei. And they don't imply a supportive election results come this October for Milei's favor. Again, this trend that we're seeing in Argentina, where there's a discontent with their current elected disruptive president, is a similar trend that we are seeing in other countries that have seen the same trend of presidents like Trump in the first term in the US, where people eventually grew disillusioned and disappointed And maybe it will result in what happened in Trump's first term and his first midterms in 2018, that maybe that many Argentines in this case will vote for the other party to balance out against their disruptive president's policies. So the Argentine people seem to be seeking perceived political stability again. And this is a sentiment that has been repeatedly chosen in many democracies after electing their disruptive leaders, as I just described. But much like those other countries, Argentina is not immune to voters possibly becoming dissatisfied with the changes and trying to go for a stable leadership and electing non-disruptive so-called stable leaders. I think about something how Joe Biden in 2020, he was perceived as the candidate for getting rid of the chaos that Trump brought. But many people were just as upset with him and his perceived instability that they saw was not any better than Trump. So this is a similar pattern of electing disruptors and jumping back to seeking stability that we are seeing in many democracies across the world right now. Another lecture that I attended pointed out the trend that had been witnessed between the gender and social isolation and what Argentine residents voted for in 2023. And there have been multiple reports that found that Milei's voters were disproportionately more male, and that the youth has a more disproportionate distinction between young males and young females. Much of this has to do with women's distrust in Milei's support of women's rights, and men who are upset at the ongoing changes in social issues like LGBT rights and the lack of change in Argentina's economic status. This aligns with another global trend that we see in Europe and the US at least, where men, especially younger men, are being drawn to the sensationalist, disruptive rhetoric of strong men leaders who portray a sense of conservative change in the world that has seemed to grow more liberal in its cultural shifts, that make many men especially feel left behind in their own countries. This is a similar sentiment that many Brexit voters have felt when they voted for support of leaving the EU. In the US, many feel this with immigrants, and in Argentina, many feel that the welfare state that supposedly has been supporting its people has only been a burden to the whole country and should instead convert to a more pro-market state, as Milei has praised. However, of course, this does not speak to all men, as some Argentine men, including those who voted for Milei in 2023, have become just as disillusioned by him recently. And though the recent provincial elections are too early to have data on the gender disparities, at least by the time I was writing this, it seems that the growing discontent is not exclusively for women only, and might see also a significant amount of men who have become disillusioned by Milei's presidency and voting against his party. Another interesting aspect I heard from this lecture was that there was this interesting correlation between men who voted for Milei reported having difficulties in interacting with women in social spaces compared to those who did not report this. Now, this is a very interesting report that they brought up because it provided at least me with insight into the disparity between social skills and its potential translation into political action, especially when these social skills, lack thereof, is more manifested in digital social skills, where things are more online and not too personal. So the lecturer connected this with Robert Putnam's bowling alone concept, where Putnam had found this growing isolation in social events, including in bowling, that has seen a decrease in social interactions. So originally this report was in the US, but it has been applied to UK and Argentine politics as a similar growing decrease in social interactions, especially in this time when digital media has become a replacement for in-person interactions, and especially from the surge in our reliance on the digital realm post-COVID-19 pandemic. So what is interesting here is that the growing lack of social interactions, including in communications with the opposite sex in a heterosexual majority world, is translating itself into political action in favor of usually right-wing causes. So I saw this concept kind of go beyond the traditional politics, traditional political realm, as it reminds me of this phenomenon where people will tend to be more vocal and say more bold and possibly offensive statements online, where the repercussions are minimal compared to in person. So the internet is a realm where we can essentially be our truest selves without fear of judgment compared to the way people in-person interactions usually have. And from this, we seem to be seeing the most raw part of ourselves that we air online almost be practiced through voting preferences in a way. Now, this might be a result of algorithmic comfort where the algorithm on our smartphones does not expand our mind, but instead concentrates our ideas to remain in familiar spaces. And something like instituting conservative policies in the face of change is one space that many men who might be lacking traditional in-person social skills might be seeking comfort in trying to stop changes. Now, this is all theoretical, but it's simply something I want to point out as a potential concern in the findings that the lecturer provided us. And of course, correlation does not mean causation here. But as someone who has grown up with technology at this more personalized scale, as I've witnessed, especially from my youth, I have witnessed people becoming increasingly isolated from their communities and they have been lacking some of the same social skills I remember being practiced when I was younger, including making eye contact with people or just even saying things like hello or thank you. So this might have something to do with the mobilization of the political support that is able to attract younger men who have reported having difficulties interacting with women to vote for figures like Milei as a counterweight to the unfamiliar change that many naturally are opposed to. So additionally, in my time here, I decided to travel to Chile, to Santiago and some neighboring cities. And I was immersing myself in that culture to grasp the differences between there and Argentina. And what I found was quite astounding, actually. So both countries share similar histories. And the fact that they have different methods of closure really stood out to me. So for example, both endured dictatorships with Argentina under the Reorganización Nacional and Chile under the dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet. So Chile, since its dictatorship, has taken a more conciliatory approach in dealing with what happened in the past, including the establishment of the Museum of Memory and Human Rights, which I visited, is a national single cohesive solution to coming to terms with the past. Whereas in Argentina, there isn't any similar cohesive institution that acts as the national body of reference to its dictatorship years. Instead, the consensus from human rights organizations and the Argentine government's response to the Reorganización Nacional has been having a spread out network of institutions be the body of reference for what happened during that time. So for some, the Chilean response implies that there are no excuses for what happened, and that what occurred during the Pinochet dictatorship is a nationally agreed disgrace for Chile. But for others, it might be an issue of highly centralized government that does not want stories not already included in something like the Museum of Memory and Human Rights to be a part of the national dialogue. Whereas in Argentina, it can be perceived that the state is supportive enough to let voices speak freely across the country on what occurred and give their own respective stories as a part of a national network with no absolute answer to what happened. But for others, it can be seen that the state continues to lack accountability and not wanting to firmly declare a single national institution that provides a clear point of reference to its history. And thus, it might show that the state is still not completely in agreement and completely disapproving of what occurred during the dictatorship. Or at least the people do not have a cohesive answer to what they found was a disgrace for Argentina. So the cultural connections with the Mapuche people, the indigenous people of Patagonia, which transcends both across the Chilean and Argentine borders, is another phenomenon that differs between the two countries. So the two capital cities of Argentina and Chile had different levels of Mapuche cultural expression, as the flag was waved more visibly in my few days in Santiago than I have seen living in Buenos Aires for the past 2.5 months. So this seems to have a lot to do with the histories, as Chile had a comparatively more tolerant approach to Mapuche land rights than Argentina. The cultural construction of the two countries also shows how each country differs in their expression of their respective Latino identity. Now, coming from a Mexican heritage, the Aztec and Mayan people have been incorporated into the culture of Mexico. It's something you see in the murals and the identity of even the language in Mexican culture. And as the identity of Mexico is based off of this merge between the Spanish and the indigenous identity. In Chile, it's a similar story where we have indigenous roots is also seen as vital to the Chilean identity, as there are also so many indigenous people who even reside in the country, including those who come from indigenous peoples who resided outside of Chile's borders. So in this case, there's a bit of a similar approach with Mexico in having this combination with the indigenous people in the identity of Chile. However, in Argentina, they pride itself more on its immigrants coming from countries, including many from Europe, that made up a unique cultural mix between immigrants and the colonial Spanish culture. But the indigenous culture of the Mapuche is not treated with the same regard in Argentina. Now, Chilean culture also has a better political recognition of the Mapuche compared to Argentina. And in the US, we have this similar dynamic, I notice, with the two cultural recognitions and values depending on the part of the country that you're in. For instance, the Western states cultures, like in Montana or in South Dakota, carry more indigenous people's cultures in the state culture. Whereas in states like New York or California, we pride ourselves in our immigrant cultural mix that shaped our respective states. And it's not so much of the similar dynamic that you might see in somewhere like Montana, that the indigenous people are as incorporated in the culture of a place like California, where I'm from. It's interesting to see this similar regard or disregard of certain cultures as a common trend that transcends American borders and can be found throughout Latin America, with these two examples already a great example of this. And it amazes me that these two countries that border each other through the Andes have undergone divergent cultural histories that have shaped what has become of these two countries' relationships with the exact same indigenous tribe. So already from my time here, I've become more aware of the diversity of Latin America, especially from a Southern Cone perspective. And it's actually made me take issue with the generalization of Latin America as a whole, as I was raised to perceive this region as a region proving itself as this region is now proving itself no simple monolith in its culture nor its politics. Being Latino used to mean something much more different to me before moving here, and the concept of Latin America was something I once believed was easy to study through one country like Mexico or Argentina to get the full image. But this region has proven itself so beautifully complex as I spend more time here, because their relations with their respective indigenous people, their immigration histories, and even in their language differences, as Argentines and Chileans refer to their Spanish language, which is really Spanish still, as Castellano, a unique version of Spanish to their respective countries that not even my native Spanish-speaking Mexican grandmother would be able to understand what they're saying here easily. So I'm amazed by the nuances I'm discovering here by living here in such a unique region of the world that, coming from the US, was such an inappropriately generalized region as one and the same. And although this region shares the concept of being considered Latino, even that term is so loaded, and it's proving itself to mean different things in each country. And I cannot wait to continue exploring these concepts in further details.